Welcome to our deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at the Irish potato famine. You've probably heard about it. I mean, who hasn't?
Yeah, it's certainly one of those historical events that sticks with you.
For sure. So we've got a ton of your research here. Historical accounts, scientific analysis of the whole potato blight thing. We're going to go beyond the devastation, though.
Right.
We want to look at England's role, their involvement.
Yeah.
And the impact the famine had on Ireland. I mean, long-term impact. Did you know that a lot of people think that British policies actually made things worse, even though it was a natural disaster to begin with?
Yeah, it's a pretty common perspective. Definitely
Fine.
something worth exploring.
Right. So we'll unpack all that.
Looking through everything you've sent, it seems like the famine wasn't really a standalone event.
Okay.
It seems more like, the culmination of centuries of conflict and power struggles, like all these things built up to this.
So Ireland's history was kind of messy even before the famine hit.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine a people who resisted the Roman Empire. We're talking serious independent spirit here. From Celtic origins and fighting off the Romans to St. Patrick bringing Catholicism, Viking invasions, they kicked them out eventually.
That's a lot.
Then the Normans invaded, and that's when the English really started to take control. It's all connected to the famine. Centuries of English rule created policies that put the Irish at a disadvantage. It's like the stage was set for a catastrophe.
You mentioned the Norman invasion. There's a guy, Dermot McMurrough. He gets compared to Ephialtes, the Greek traitor.
Oh, yeah.
Why is he so important?
Good one. Okay, so McMurrough was a king caught up in all these power struggles. Around the 12th century, he invited the English to get involved in Ireland. He asked King Henry II for help, and that opened the door to centuries of English control.
Wow.
It's a huge turning point. Really sets the stage for the power dynamics at play during the famine.
Okay, so let's fast forward a few centuries. Oliver Cromwell comes onto the scene, and your research doesn't really paint him in a good light.
No, not at all.
What did he do?
Cromwell's time in Ireland was brutal. He wanted to crush Irish resistance and solidify English control. He was driven by religion and politics. And his plantations policy was a big turning point. That's when they took land from Irish Catholics and gave it to English settlers.
That's harsh.
Yeah. A lot of Irish families were forced to move to smaller, less fertile land. They became even more reliant on the potato for survival.
So they were being set up to rely on just one crop? A crop that could just, disappear overnight? Talk about risky?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ironically, the potato was a good thing initially.
Okay.
I mean, it grew really well in Ireland.
I see.
It was readily available and it provided a lot of calories.
So the potato was both good and bad for the Irish.
Yeah, kind of a double-edged sword. It helped them survive, but also made them super vulnerable.
So when the blight hit in 1845...
It devastated them.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a failed crop. It was the collapse of their whole way of life.
Let's talk about the blight. Phytophthora infestans. That's the scientific name, right?
Right.
It sounds pretty serious. And it looks like it just tore through the country. One of the sources you sent had a really vivid description of what happened.
Yeah.
Could you tell me about that?
Sure. It talked about rural Ireland, where life really centered around the potato.
Right.
Imagine seeing your fields rotting
Oh, man.
and that smell of decay just hanging in the air.
That's awful.
Yeah. Food, livelihood, the future, all gone.
It must have felt like the end of the world.
Absolutely. And this wasn't just a local thing. This blight, Phytophthora infestans, it's highly contagious, like this fungus-like thing. It spread all over Europe. But Ireland was hit the hardest. They were so dependent on the potato. The blight spread like wildfire. Transformed Ireland, left starvation and despair behind.
And that's when the real tragedy of the famine starts.
Yeah, over 1 million people died. And another 1 million emigrated. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Like almost a third of Ireland's population gone in just a few years.
It's hard to even imagine a loss that big. And then there's the whole controversy about how the British government handled things. I mean, yeah, it was a natural disaster that started the famine. But you're saying that British policies actually made the suffering worse.
Yeah, a lot of historians think so. It's complicated, though. They did try to do some things, but whether those things actually helped, that's up for debate.
Like, they banned importing food from Scotland, right? Doesn't that seem kind of counterproductive? I mean, people are starving.
Yeah, it seems that way now. But back then, laissez-faire economics was the big thing. The government wasn't supposed to interfere with the market.
So they just thought the market would magically fix everything while people were dying.
It's not quite that simple. The British government saw the famine as a security threat, too. They were worried about unrest, rebellion, all that. So they sent 200,000 soldiers to keep things under control instead of sending aid.
So politics and prejudice came before helping people.
Yeah, you could say that. One of the sources you sent had this quote from a British essayist. He was actually advocating for crushing the Irish like a half-starved rat.
Wow.
It's shocking, right?
Yeah.
It shows you how the British viewed the Irish back then. And that definitely influenced how the government responded.
We talked about how phytophthora infestans affected all of Europe, but the famine hit Ireland way harder. Why is that?
That's a good question. It all comes down to the blight.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating organism, but also devastating. It spreads through these tiny spores that travel by wind and rain. They infect the plants, and then, well, the potatoes just rot.
And back then, they couldn't stop it.
I mean, they didn't have the fungicides we have now. There wasn't a whole lot farmers could do.
So the blight's spreading fast, there's nothing to stop it, and then the British government blocks aid from coming in.
Exactly. They even turned away help from the Ottoman Sultan and a shipment from the U.S.
Seriously?
Yeah. Imagine if they had accepted that aid. Who knows how many lives could have been saved.
It's just tragic. They did set up those work programs, right, and workhouses. But they sound more like death traps, according to your research.
Yeah, the work programs were brutal, and they weren't very effective. The jobs were too hard for people who were already starving. And the workhouses were supposed to be a last resort, but they were just overcrowded and filthy. Disease spread like crazy. They became symbols of suffering, really.
So people are starving, aid is blocked. What else could they do but try to escape? That's when they started fleeing to America and Canada, right? Your research mentioned these coffin ships.
Emigration was their only hope. But it was dangerous. Put yourself in their shoes. You have to leave your home, your family. You have nothing. You're crammed onto the ship. People are sick. People are dying all around you.
Oh, man.
Yeah, conditions were so bad that the ships got nicknamed coffin ships because so many people died on board.
It's hard to imagine the courage it must have taken to do that. Leave everything behind, travel to somewhere completely new, and risk dying along the way.
It shows how desperate they were. They just wanted to survive. But for a lot of them, the journey was just too much. They died at sea, their hopes for a better life, gone.
And the ones who did make it, what was it like for them in America? Were they welcomed?
Most of them arrived with nothing, traumatized, and they had to face even more challenges in America. Poverty, discrimination.
You're talking about the No Irish Need Apply signs?
Yeah, pure discrimination.
Wow.
And they were forced to live in slums, like Hell's Kitchen in New York. Imagine coming to a new country, hoping for a better life and being met with that kind of hostility.
It's not that different from what a lot of immigrants face today. Makes you think about the fight for equality, you know? History just keeps repeating itself.
Yeah, you're right. What happened to the Irish back then is still relevant today. Marginalized communities are still fighting for acceptance, for opportunity, all over the world.
But despite all that, weren't there some Irish immigrants who managed to build a new life? Success stories.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Even with all that hardship, some people were able to overcome the obstacles. They built new lives, contributed to American society. Some even rose to positions of power. It's important to remember those stories.
Yeah.
They show the incredible strength and resilience of the Irish.
It's a testament to the human spirit. Even when things seem hopeless, there's always that hope and resilience. The famine, I mean, it ended eventually, but it still affected Ireland in a big way, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The population dropped drastically. Their society, their culture, it was all changed forever.
Yeah.
And they felt betrayed by the British government. That really fueled Irish nationalism.
It's like this collective trauma became part of their identity. What do you mean by that?
Well, the famine kind of forced social and political change. The fight for land reform, Irish home rule, it all intensified. And there was a cultural revival, too. They were rediscovering their language, music, literature. All this contributed to a distinct Irish identity, separate from England, and resilient, you know.
So they were galvanized by this horrible event. It wasn't just the suffering. It was about who they were in the world.
Exactly. The famine became a symbol. Oppression, resilience, and the fight for independence. It still shapes how they view things. Politics, economics, social justice. It's fascinating, right? The potato blight wasn't just in Ireland, but the famine hit them the hardest.
Yeah. It shows you can't just rely on one crop. It's just too risky. And it makes you wonder about how governments respond to these crises, especially when it hits certain groups harder than others.
That's a really important point. The Irish potato famine is like a warning. We need diverse food systems, resilient ones, and we need social safety nets, so no one gets left behind when something like this happens.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the big lessons we can take away from all this?
I think it shows us how interconnected we are. The choices leaders make, the fragility of our food, how human actions can have a lasting impact. It's a challenge to build a fairer world where everyone has what they need and where we're ready for whatever challenges come next.
We've covered so much. History, politics, the human impact, even the science behind the blight. It's been eye-opening, to say the least. Any last thoughts?
I think the main thing is to remember that understanding the past isn't just about looking back. It's about learning, growing. As tragic as it was, the famine has lessons for us. Lessons that can help us navigate the present and build a better future for everyone.
That's a powerful message. Thank you for taking us on this deep dive. It's clear that the Irish potato famine still resonates today, not just in Ireland, but everywhere. It makes us think about our own role in creating a more just and sustainable world.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.